name is Steve Clemons. I head the foreign policy programs here at the New America Foundation. And some of us thought that because two of our big guns in our foreign policy program, particularly our new president, Steve Coll, who's of course the new president of the New America Foundation, but also with the New Yorker magazine, had just returned from Pakistan, as well as Peter Bergen, a senior fellow here with the New America Foundation, and CNN's terrorism analyst, who are coming back. And our third big gun here at New America, who heads our Geopolitics of Energy initiative, Flynt Leverett, also a senior fellow here and former Bush administration National Security Council official, had a piece out on Ceylon recently that gathered a lot of attention on views towards Pakistan. We thought it would be nice to do an afternoon roundtable and have a nice discussion about some of the issues involving Pakistan. But obviously we sent this out Friday and there was a lot of interest, and in that time, really from Friday morning when I first learned about it, Nicholas Schmidle, who's here as a fellow of the Institute for Current World Affairs and has been based in Pakistan with his wife Ricky over the last 2 years, was under threat of deportation, was actually on the way to be deported, and convinced someone at the last moment to give him an afternoon and an evening to get out of the country, and basically left a whole life behind in Pakistan. And so we were able to ask Nick Schmidle to join us as well. I apologize to those of you who are standing. We have a TV room in the back. It will all be digitally recorded. We will put that material on our web for those of you in the country. We're going to have 5 to 6 minutes of from each of our speakers in bullets, and then I will moderate a discussion with all of you as well as I can, given the crowd. So let me first ask Flynt Leverett to help set the stage. He'll go first. Then I'm going to ask Peter Bergen to follow, then Nick Schmidle, and then Steve Coll. So Flynt Leverett.
All right. Thank you very much, and thanks to all of you for coming out. There are obviously people at this table who know more about on-the-ground conditions in Pakistan in a more granular way than I do. And so I want to throw out a few ideas at the outset that I hope will frame our discussion when we get into the question and answer period. And what I want to do is try and frame the problem in terms of U.S. strategy, U.S. foreign policy, and what are some of the realities that policymakers should be taking account of, but I think to a large extent are either ignoring or trying to look the other way with regard to these realities. The first proposition I would throw out is that you really need, particularly in the context of the war on terror, you need to think about Pakistan and Afghanistan as a strategic complex. We are somewhat accustomed to thinking about Pakistan as part of a strategic complex with India, and certainly there are good reasons for that. But in the post 9/11 period, the really important strategic complex that policymakers have to tend to in the context of the war on terror is this complex between Pakistan and Afghanistan. And in particular, what we are focusing on, or should be, is the complex between southeastern Pakistan, southeastern Afghanistan and northwestern Pakistan, essentially a Pashtun-dominated area, which is the locus both for the Taliban movement, including its more recent resurgence, and the locus for bin Laden al-Qaeda in its post 9/11 phase. And I think it's important to understand that you can't think about either Afghanistan or Pakistan as a policy problem in isolation from the other. You have to be willing to think about the two of them together. The second proposition I want to throw out is more focused on Pakistan, but with an eye to Afghanistan. And that proposition is that Pakistan can certainly be extremely helpful, critically helpful, in various ways in our efforts to root out and destroy Al-Qaeda and its Taliban allies. Pakistan can be, and I would say has been, in many ways, quite helpful in that effort and could be so in the future. But you have to recognize that there are limits to what Pakistan can do, to what any Pakistani leader would be willing to do. And this doesn't mean that Pakistani leaders are particularly bad or craven. It simply means that they have their own sets of interests and that those interests do not always overlap with those of the United States in the war on terror. And so while I think it is important to cultivate Pakistan as an ally in the war on terror, it is a serious mistake not to recognize that there are limits to how far Pakistan can go in helping us, and that if we don't in some way acknowledge and respect those limits, the results are going to be counterproductive, not just for Pakistan, but they will be counterproductive, first of all, for U.S. interests in the war on terror. The third proposition I would like to throw out is that since September 11, the Bush administration has basically ignored the first two propositions that I just put on the table, and that has made the situation in Pakistan and the situation between the United States and Pakistan much worse, much more problematic than it needed to be. I can talk at great length, as some of you know, I can talk at great length about what I think are the many mistakes that the Bush administration has made since 9/11, and I'll certainly be prepared to do that in the question period. Let me just say right now, I think that the biggest mistake that we made was not finishing the job against bin Laden and the cadre of Al-Qaeda leaders around him in Afghanistan when we had the chance to do so. And I don't mean just at Tora Bora, I'm talking more broadly than that. And that then we compounded that error by letting these guys escape Afghanistan under our military control. We let them escape Afghanistan and take up residence inside Pakistani territory. If you want to guarantee that we will push Pakistan up against the limits of its ability to help us in the war on terror, you could not come up with a better formula than that. To let bin Laden escape and let him get across the border into Pakistan and take up residence in Pakistani territory. That is from the, not just the perspective of Musharraf, but from any Pakistani leader. That is close to a nightmare scenario, and we let it happen. Finally, the fourth proposition I would throw out is that been a lot of talk recently in the aftermath of Benazir Bhutto's assassination and all of the commentary about U.S.-Pakistani relations about how, well, we gave Musharraf $10 billion and we haven't gotten our money's worth. Let's just do a little bit of truthiness here about that. I mean, first of all, a little over half of that figure is not aid or assistance. It is reimbursement to the Pakistani military for the expenses that they accrued while undertaking operations or doing other things that we wanted them to do, that we asked them to do in the context of the war, on terror. So half of that money isn't even assistance, it's reimbursing the Pakistani military for things that we asked them to do. But you still say, okay, that's going to leave close to $5 billion. That's not a trivial sum. Yeah, but look at when we actually got it to Musharraf. You know, he has his, you know, Mr. Armitage says he didn't exactly threaten to bomb Pakistan back in the Stone Age, as General Musharraf's memoir would have it. But it is pretty clear that both on the phone with Powell and then in person with Armitage, that Musharraf got a very severe message from the Bush administration in the immediate aftermath of 9/11. He actually, as I said, he did a lot of things in, let's say, the 2 years following that were extremely helpful to the United States. But we did not get around to putting together a serious package of assistance for Pakistan. We didn't even begin to assemble it until 2003 when Musharraf came to the White House. And in real terms, Musharraf didn't begin to see, it didn't get enacted by Congress, and Musharraf didn't get to see significant amounts of the money until 2005. By which point, bin Laden was already in Pakistan, you know, et cetera, et cetera. So, you know, I think we need to be honest about our own shortcomings in managing this relationship. We need to be honest and sober in the way we look at what Pakistan can actually do for us. And I think, while obviously Benazir Bhutto's assassination is a tragedy on many levels, you know, doesn't it strike anyone as somewhat ironic that once again the Bush administration is turning to a Western-educated exile political figure working to restore that person to power in their native country, which they had to leave under difficult circumstances, but try and restore that person to power so that the Bush administration, the United States, can get a government it can work with more easily. You know, we have seen this bad movie before since 9/11. It doesn't work very well. It didn't work very well with regard to Ahmed Chalabi and Iraq. Fortunately, the flirtation with Reza Pahlavi and as a centerpiece for regime change strategies in Iran didn't last very long, but it surely would not have worked there. And I don't think it would have worked particularly well in Pakistan either. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Flint. We have a lot of journalists here, so I'm going to take a moment just to remind folks that Flint is a senior fellow at the New America Foundation, the director of our Geopolitics of Energy initiative here, and the former senior director for Middle East Affairs at the National Security Council. I'm going to ask all the speakers from this point forward, because of our cameras back there, to speak at the podium. And we now have Peter Bergen, is Schwartz Senior Fellow at the New America Foundation, of course CNN's terrorism analyst, and Peter launches something, is the co-director now of New America's brand new terrorism and counter-insurgency initiative. Peter Bergen.
Thanks, Steve. I'm going to sort of, my comments are going to be more micro than Flint's. I have a slight disagreement with Flint in the sense that, you know, unlike Chalabi was scoring, I think in one poll his numbers were below Saddam Hussein, and a recent poll in Pakistan put Benazir Bhutto at 63% and her party, the PPP, at something like 30%, which is not to disagree with Flint's overall point, but this Benazir was much more popular than Chalabi, and instead of leaving Iraq in 1952 as Chalabi did, she left, you know, 10 years ago under a cloud. But I think Flint's main point is correct in the sense trying to micromanage these things from the United States may not be so smart. But my brief here is just to look into the question of who killed Benazir, what killed her, and what it might mean. I have an article in the current New Republic which basically looks at this. What killed her, you know, there's a dispute in Pakistan about whether it was a bullet or whether she hit her head on the sunroof lever in the car she was driving in. This is not a trivial dispute. It may seem, you know, obviously somebody killed her. But the reason that this is important is because if she died with an assassin's bullet, it would help the PPP basically with our argument that the Pakistani government didn't really protect her sufficiently enough. The PPP says that they asked for professional security guards, even they approached Blackwater, and that the Interior Ministry would not allow the PPP to have international security guards. If, on the other hand, the government is correct that she was killed by the sunroof lever, this would militate against the idea that she didn't really have professional protection, because it's almost impossible to protect yourself against a suicide bomber. The evidence that exists, I think, actually supports the government position. The government's in a very unfortunate position that anything they say no one believes. Ironically, everything they've said about this case is actually probably true. For instance, it seems to me fairly clear that she did die not with an assassin's bullet, but she died striking her head in the car that she was being driven. She either fell or was pushed by the bomb blast. The reason I say that is if you look at the medical report, there's no exit wound. There are no fragments of the bullets. The medical report, of course, is not an autopsy, but it is the best thing that we have. And so for right now, I think the government explanation of how she died is probably correct. Who killed her? 50% of Pakistanis believe she was killed by the government. And of course, you know, Pakistanis are notoriously prone to conspiracies, partly because their history is rife with conspiracies. But I don't think that the government had any role to play in this, at least in terms of Musharraf. Musharraf lost whatever shreds of popularity he might have already had. Senior members of the Pakistani military have no interest in fomenting instability in the country. Which is not to say that there weren't low-level military or perhaps rogue elements of the intelligence agencies involved. One model to look at, in December of 2003, Musharraf survived 2 very serious assassination attempts. The people who conducted those assassination attempts, 4 of them were members of the Pakistani Air Force. In fact, 6 of them were members of the Pakistani Air Force. 4 of them were later sentenced to death and 2 to life imprisonment. That was on December 14th, 2003. On December 25th, another round of attacks, this time by the Special Services Group, the very same commando unit that Musharraf himself belongs to. And so in both of these attacks, which were masterminded by al-Qaeda or its affiliates, low-level military personnel were deeply involved. Both of these attacks also happened in Rawalpindi, where Benazir Bhutto was killed. So that, to me, seems a plausible. If there is government involvement, is this kind of low-level military involvement? But the larger question of who the intellectual author of all this is, you know, the Pakistani government quickly fingered Ayatollah Masood, while an all too plausible candidate can see he's the head of the Pakistani Taliban. He denied any role. They released a transcript of a conversation he's supposed to have with a mullah crony, basically celebrating this attack. He denied and disavowed the transcript, but the Pakistani government has since then placed audio tape of that exchange on a Pakistani government website, and Masood has said absolutely nothing to say, that's not me. So it seems to me that a plausible constellation of people that would have done this attack are Taliban and al-Qaeda, which have morphed together ideologically, tactically in the last 2 years. They see themselves at war with the Pakistani state, which is a relatively new development since, of course, they were helped in many ways by the Pakistani state in the last decade or so. But if the 60 suicide attacks we've seen in Pakistan in the last year or so, which were quite rare events, have mostly been directed against Pakistani government officials, Pakistani police officials, ISI, etc. And so Benazir's death, I think, fits into that pattern. And the government's contention that this was a Taliban-directed attack with al-Qaeda, I think, seems plausible. What does this all mean? Obviously, it changes a lot of things within Pakistan in terms of the politics. But you know, there was a lot of sort of hysterical commentary in this country that, you know, Pakistan it's very similar to the Shah's Iran. This is really nonsensical. There is no religious figure in Pakistan that is remotely of the stature, as it were, of Ayatollah Khomeini. And in fact, if you look at the Pakistani Islamist parties, they are doing worse than they've done in their history. In 2002, they were getting something like, they got 11% of the vote, which is the best they've ever done. That allowed them to take over the Northwest Frontier province and Baluchistan. But in the election scheduled for February 18th, I think it's going to be a rout for the Islamist coalition called the MMA. They're likely to lose their control of the Northwest Frontier province. They're likely to lose their semi-control of Baluchistan. And the big winners, of course, will be the PPP and Nawaz Sharif and other secular opposition parties. And I think that is the plausible scenario looking forward. Thanks.
Thank you, Peter. And now we have my friend Nicholas Schmidle. He and his wife, as has been reported, were essentially given a deportation order. Just left Pakistan, have just come back. And of course, Nicholas, who's a fellow at the Institute of Current World Affairs and a freelance writer, had the mesmerizing, detail-rich piece in the New York Times Magazine weekend last week called Next Gen Taliban that gathered quite a bit. He also has a series of dispatches from where he was reporting that just came out in slate.com of those who'd like to do it. Let me ask Nicholas Schmidle to share with us his thoughts. I've just asked the door be opened back there so more folks can hear.
Well, Steve, thanks so much for getting me in on the panel at the last minute. I would actually rather not be here today. I'd rather still be in Pakistan. But unfortunately, incidents sort of turned against us in the middle of last week. My wife and I arrived in Pakistan in February of 2006 on a writing fellowship from the Institute of Current World Affairs. And those that are not familiar with the Institute of Current World Affairs, it's a very open-ended, freewheeling fellowship that allows you to just kind of pursue whatever happens to be your interest at the time. And so over the course of the past 2 years, I've traveled freely throughout the country and have been reporting on everything from rock stars who are writing movie soundtracks, kind of cashing in their cultural clout to write movie soundtracks that went against Islamic fundamentalism, to profiling politicians, to, over the past several months, I had really become enamored with what I saw, this emerging division within the Islamist and within the Taliban movement, between kind of the Taliban of old and the next generation of Taliban, mainly underwritten by the fact that Mullah Omar's Taliban that we all associate with the government that was in Afghanistan prior to 2001 is no longer the Taliban, and the characters and dimensions of that movement have really transformed a lot over the past year, essentially. The Taliban, this was really evident to me during this insurrection at the Red Mosque last year in July, when two brothers, Abdul Rashid Ghazi and Abdul Aziz, led what essentially was a rebellion against the government inside Islamabad. As I mentioned in the story, though, one of the things that really was most fascinating to me was not the rebellion, the armed rebellion that lasted 10 days at the beginning of July, but over the prior months, what you saw was that the traditional religious establishment in Pakistan was completely powerless to stop these two renegade brothers. The religious parties, the MMA, condemned them, and the brothers, as one of the Abdul Rashid Ghazi told me, okay, well, all these guys are, he essentially said that everyone's getting old, we're the young ones, and the old ones just kind of become irrelevant, and this is who we are now, we're the ones that are coming up. Also, the Madrasa board, it's called Wafaq al-Madaris, which looks over about 10,000 of the Deobandi madrasas in Pakistan, also condemned what the brothers were doing, and the brothers also turned up their nose. And finally, perhaps most significantly, there's a very powerful relationship, this sort of spiritual advisor, they call it a pir. The pir of Abdul Aziz, one of the two brothers, had condemned him and said that essentially this is not the way to do it. And that would be, I mean, it's a very, very, very important and prized relationship. And Abdul Aziz's response was, well, this is what we're doing, and he kind of brushed him aside. So all of these, you saw this fracture within the religious establishment. So come September, October, November, I began reporting on this, largely in the Northwest Frontier Province and in Baluchistan. I was profiling Maulana Fazl Rahman, who, as head of the MMA, kind of represents the old guard of Taliban and is often called the Taliban our boys over the past 10 years or so. And so we spent a lot of time with Maulana Fazl Rahman in Deir Ismail Khan, which is where he's from. It's about a half an hour outside of South Waziristan. And then in the middle of October, I was able to get into the Swat Valley, which is the area that has since become engulfed in an insurgency, and was able to spend a day with this Maulana Fazlullah, who has become one of these top renegade Taliban commanders. And about 15,000 people amassed at the mosque for Friday prayers, and afterwards, 15,000 people went across to another area where they had set up a platform, and they proceeded to walk three young boys who had been charged in a kidnapping plot up on the platform, and to lay each of the boys down face first on the platform, hold their arms, and one Taliban wearing a ski mask held up a leather whip and cracked it over these kids' backs 25, 20, and 15 times. I was the only foreign journalist there. It was covered in the press the next day, but in no detail, just kind of that this had happened. So, so this scene features in the story, and I have a feeling is kind of also what perhaps ticked off the government, and this is not the sort of thing that they wanted to see out. The other thing that was remarkable to me, and this has just changed in the past, while I was reporting the story, I saw the Taliban being a very fractured, even themselves being very fractured, being almost like an assembly of gangs, if you will. As the Taliban were sending around letters to local DVD store owners and cable owners, they were all being signed by different Taliban groups. And then in about the second week of December, the Taliban all met in South Waziristan and all united under the name of Pakistani Tehreek-e-Taliban, which means the Pakistani Taliban movement, under the leadership of this Bayatullah Masood. And since then, it's changed the whole dynamic, because now all of a sudden you have all these marginalized and fractionalized groups all over the border areas that are now operating under a single command. So the story came out on Sunday, the 6th of January. On Monday, I came back after having been out during the day, and our guard told us that an ISI agent had stopped by the house and told us that our visa had been canceled, that I had been writing against Pakistan, and that we were living in Pakistan illegally. So I made some calls and thought, okay, so this isn't necessarily a good sign, but I thought it was typical post-controversial story. You know, this happens a lot. You write something big, and they come around the next day, and they kind of check on people and harass, essentially just try and make sure that they know that you know that they're watching. On Tuesday night, I came back, and the same guard said, looking much more concerned, that we had the police had stopped by 2 or 3 times, and they were coming back in an hour. So, you know, it hadn't rained for like 6 months. And so Monday, Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday, it's just absolute driving rainstorm, the worst weather that we'd seen all week. I mean, probably all year. And on Tuesday night, there was a police officer standing in the rain, and he said that we're here to take you to the airport, you and your wife. And I asked why, and he didn't give a reason. He just said, I don't know, I have orders. He handed me this deportation notice that said that you're to leave Pakistan immediately, cited no reason. So I called a friend of ours who we essentially thought of every single influential person we knew in the country and tried to just at least buy some time. It was evident by this point that we weren't going to stick around. We were no longer welcome in the country. We took that as a hint. But all that we wanted, we'd been living there for 2 years. My wife had been enrolled at the International Islamic University, was finishing up a master's. Both of us, you know, she had learned, she was about to take her Arabic exam on Tuesday morning. She had a job. She had a lot more ties. I had kind of finished the story and was taking a deep breath, figuring out what I was going to do next. And so we both just picked up everything and left. There was no, according to the Washington Post mentions that there was a deal hammered out between us and the government. There was no such deal that I'm aware of unless someone else is hammering out a deal on my behalf. We contacted a friend and just asked, who up until now, the government has still not given me any official reason why we were left. There are about 4 or 5 different stories, including the Interior Ministry official who alleged that Benazir Bhutto hit her head on the sunroof ledge. He has alleged that there was no deportation order ever given. So the one that I'm holding, I guess he's considering is not to be real. That's about it. So we, Friday morning, we got on a flight, and of course they lost my wife's bag. All 7 of mine came here, but they lost my wife's bag. Yeah. And we arrived Saturday afternoon and are now just trying to figure out what we're going to do next. So that's about it. Thanks so much.
Thank you, Nicholas. I should mention that some of you know I have a blog. I'm going to put a copy, because I've never seen a deportation order before, but I'm going to have a copy of Nick's up there just because I think it's an interesting curiosity to add to the sort of cultural enrichment of Washington. Now let me ask my good friend and colleague Steve Coll, president of the New American Foundation. Of course, he's won 2 Pulitzers, most recently for Ghost Wars, a New Yorker staff writer, and also our other co-director of our new terrorism and counterinsurgency initiative here at New America. Steve Coll.
Thank you, Steve. I'd just like to join Steve in welcoming you to New America and thank Nick for coming. Just a terrific reporter. Any of the rest of you who are expelled from countries where you're doing important research, you're welcome at New America immediately after you return to the United States. And I, unlike my colleagues who have already published, I'm working for the New Yorker, I move much more slowly. So I have actually a very large piece coming out next week about the relationship between the Pakistani state and the insurgency that Nick's reporting describes. And so in deference to my editors, I'm not going to describe everything that's in that piece a week before it's published, but I wanted to try to look ahead a little bit and talk about the next 3 to 6 to 12 months, both in reference to Pakistani politics and to the relationship between the state and this insurgency. I used to think of it as a low-grade insurgency, but I'm not so sure anymore how to measure its degree of intensity. It's certainly increasing, and I think Nick's description of the chronology from the Red Mosque forward and the formation of the Taliban Tariq is an accurate way to mark a couple of its inflection points over the last year. You could say, who are the insurgents first before we turn to this question of their strengths and the state's strengths in response to them. I think Peter described that accurately. You have a few hundred core foreign al-Qaeda up in the Fatah. You have I think, a separate leadership organization for the Afghan Taliban. Now you have an aspirational leadership for the more diffuse Pakistani Taliban called the Taliban Tehreek. And then you have these bands of radicals who have come out of the Red Mosque or out of Lashkar-e-Taiba or out of Sipa-e-Saba, essentially non-Pashto speaking either Kashmiri or sectarian jihadis who have ended up in the West either because they were being chased after the Red Mosque or because that's where the action is around SWAT and they wanted a piece of it. So this is not a coherent monolith, but I think that's more or less what it's made of. I did have a chance on this last trip to go out west. I wouldn't claim to have traveled as extensively as Nick out there, but it is striking how quickly things are changing out there. It really is quite an interesting and an unsettling time in the frontier province and around the base of the Fatah. Of course, you can't get up in the Fatah on your own unless you want to end up in one of those not very pleasant Taliban videos that are available in the local marketplaces. So I just wanted to talk about the next 6 months in reference to sort of some broader developments in Pakistani politics and in constitutional sort of arrangements. Essentially, this insurgency is gathering strength while the state is weakening, and the state is weakening because this long run that President Musharraf has enjoyed has come now to an end. It came to an end, in my mind, when he took his uniform off and resigned as Chief of Army Staff and inaugurated a set of constitutional arrangements in Pakistan that have really no direct precedent. There are two, and actually more if you reach back further, but there are two recent periods of arrangements in Pakistan where you had a civilian president, an elected prime minister, and a chief of army staff, a kind of triangular arrangement. Neither of those periods were particularly happy, but neither of them is a direct analog to what's now about to occur, because you never had a civilian president who was previously chief of army staff who believes that he is the mentor of the next chief of army staff, and who also is the person who appointed the chief of ISI, the most important intelligence organization in the country, and who believes that he's going to sustain a set of relationships with that general, Nadim Taj, based on their past history and uniform together. And you can, if you listen to the president's comments at press conferences and elsewhere, you can see him essentially inventing his constitutional role as he goes along. I was driving to Lahore one night when he made his speech about rescheduling the election, and he said, he talked about deploying the army on voting day to provide security, and he said, you know, originally I was thinking it wouldn't be a good idea to send the army out in the streets during the election, but then I decided that I would deploy the army because it seemed to me that the balance of interests suggested that I should. And I wondered if General Kiani was sitting by his radio going, sorry, you decided, sir? I mean, aren't I in charge of because traditionally that's something that the Chief of Army Staff has done. I think the most important person in Pakistan over the next year is the one we never talk about, and that's Ashraf Kiani, who's the Chief of Army Staff, a reticent person who hasn't made himself available, certainly not in comparison to this rather voluble former colleague of his who is now his civilian president in this uneasy relationship. Kiani is a child of the Pakistan Army. Literally, his father was an NCO. He grew up moving around the country in a sort of a sergeant's life. He's an infantryman who made his career in the Baluch Regiment, and he's probably the last of a generation of generals of his stature and rank to have had personal and, it seems, largely positive experience in the United States. He did a tour at Fort Leavenworth. He did a second tour someplace, I think, in Georgia, more briefly. He's generally reckoned to be a less political general, though that's a phrase in Pakistan that I think you use very cautiously, especially at his level. But perhaps a better way to say it is that he recognizes that the Army has suffered badly from its role in politics, and he thinks there would be in the institutional interests of the Army to pull back. How he can do that when he has a civilian president who's ordering them into the streets on election day is one of the narrative threads that I think we should all watch closely over the next year. But he hasn't delivered any public speeches about his agenda. The one indication that he has offered is that as soon as he became Chief of Army Staff, he declared this the year of the soldier in Pakistan, and he has positioned himself in the Army as someone who wants to get back to basics and who recognizes that the Army has suffered considerably because of the insurgency and because of its political misuse over the last couple of years. And his message is to walk into the cantonments and into the barracks and say, I'm going to concentrate on the professional tradition of the Army and try to strengthen it against its enemies. But his agenda in constitutional politics is, I think, much more opaque, and it will be very interesting to watch. I'll just finish by saying that his relationship with Musharraf for the next 6 to 12 months, I think, is the most important factor in the government's ability to prosecute a successful beginning of what will have to be a long-term counterinsurgency campaign. And if that relationship does become, in fact, stable, if they develop confidence and trust in one another, and in fact, Musharraf's hypothesis that this is his protege and that they can maintain a mentor-protege relationship successfully for a couple of years, if that proves to be true, well, it will generally promote stability and it will generally create a context in which the Army can operate against the militants more successfully. However, it would be unusual in Pakistani history if two men with those particular backgrounds turned out in these offices with these constitutional powers and this much ambiguity. If it turned out that they were successful partners, that would be an exception to the pattern. And what would seem more likely would be that over time, and it may take some time, it may take a year or two, that there will be differences of view between them. And those differences will probably be exacerbated by the Prime Minister or the coalition of civilian politicians who will come to power on February 18th. Because in past, in these triangular relations, the civilians have always tried to split the Army chief and the President from one another, and I would expect that to happen again. Just on the election, it's difficult to forecast this election because you have to start with the question, will it be free and fair? If you presume that it will be free and fair, or that the sympathy for the PPP will be so great that it'll be difficult to rig it successfully, then you would expect a greater PPP showing than you would have expected certainly in December, and maybe enough to come close to an absolute majority. That would be a real surprise. I think, though, that the Gallup poll and other measures do provide an accurate indication of popular sentiment. The question is, how will that be translated at the polls themselves? The Daily Times, I think today or yesterday I noticed, ran an editorial basically warning Musharraf not to rig it too blatantly and sort of saying that you have to understand there really is a popular wave out there and you may be able to kind of play around the edges, but you cannot, if you try to suppress it entirely, you're going to bring the country down because people will react. And I think there is a kind of a general sense of what a reasonable rigging would look like. And one element of that is certainly going to be the defeat of the MMA in the frontier in Baluchistan, in part because the MMA was a creation of the government in the first instance. It was a kind of a seat-sharing arrangement that now has been torn down, and that will create structural problems for the MMA. But anyway, I'll leave it on that note and look forward to your questions.
Great. Steve, thank you very much. I'm going to ask our speakers to rip those microphones out of their stands and hold them close so that we've got good sound, not only for the folks in the back, but I want to say hello to the people in the television room. It's an awfully full house today, and we'll do the best we can. I'm also going to ask the speakers to respond as briefly as possible and not give the 17 nuances in response. An enterprising person who probably figured I'd have a problem finding them addressed the first question, which I'll read here to Nick Schmidle. It says, much speculation surrounds the presence of foreigners in the northwestern provinces, most frequently cited sightings of Uzbeks and Chechens. It's very difficult to separate facts from fiction. Can you comment? And you can take that out and hand it back and forth. It'll be better.
Can you hear me? While I was in Swat, spending this day with Maulana Fazlullah and his cohort, we certainly noticed 1, 2, 3 Uzbeks amongst the crowd. Also, the two individuals who were administering the public punishments that day were both hooded. Well, one of them had a ski mask, the other one had a scarf around his face, leaving his eyes open. I don't want to speculate because this kind of sounds like, post-Red Mosque, where the government was saying there were certain people that weren't from around here and there. Nonetheless, the individual with his face all but covered except for hair looked like he wasn't from around there. But there were certainly at least 2 or 3 Uzbeks inside the madrasa and that were roaming around. So.
Great, thank you. Let me open the floor now. Again, one question, not 2 or 3, and we'll do the best we can moving around. Yes, sir.
I'm fascinated with Mr. Leverett's comment that we had the ability to wipe out the Al-Qaeda at one point.
So, question. It's got to be brief. We've got too many people.
That's my question.
Yeah.
How did we have this ability?
Well, I think there are 2 main threads to the story. I'll leave out the other 15 nuances. One is, of course, there's a lot of speculation whether or not bin Laden was actually at Tora Bora, and the decision not to commit U.S. troops to that battle, ground troops, may have provided him an opportunity to escape. I'm thinking more systematically that in the immediate aftermath of the invasion of Afghanistan, there were special forces cadres working with CIA paramilitary elements, just relatively small population of people who have the kind of skill set of the special forces warrior combined with the right language skills to do this job. But this combination was carrying out what I think was an initially quite effective campaign on the ground to capture Taliban and Al-Qaeda remnants as these remnants tried to flee Afghanistan in various directions. But a decision was taken at the White House in very early 2002, January or February, that these special forces elements and CIA paramilitary cadres were going to be pulled out of Afghanistan, because if these were basically the same guys you were going to use to do certain things to prepare the battlefield for Iraq. And if you wanted to give these guys any time to, reconstitute, regroup before you put them back in theater to start doing things in anticipation of an invasion of Iraq, you needed to pull these guys out in January or February of 2002. This means that in the spring of 2002, when mountain snows melted, mountain passes became accessible again, we frankly did not have the right people on the ground to capture bin Laden, to capture Zawahiri, to capture one of bin Laden's sons, and there were, groups of Taliban and Al-Qaeda figures, including bin Laden himself, who made their way to Pakistan then.
I see. Thank you. Yes, sir.
I have a question for Steve and Nick about what they think about what killed Bhutto.
Okay, I have to, or is that your question?
Yeah.
Okay, I have to repeat the questions for our TV room that can't hear the questioners. So the question is to Steve and to Nick about what killed Bhutto.
Go ahead.
I would have to agree with Peter. I think that certainly that Taliban Al-Qaeda elements were involved. Whether there was some coordination with rogue intelligence elements as well is hard to say, but I think, let's put it this way, I think the government did a really sloppy job of trying to put the blame on Beytullah Masood so early. This tape is ridiculous. They found out this recording, they found out now that that area doesn't get mobile service. And so where they were saying, yes, okay, well, I'm here in whatever area in South Waziristan, I mean, it was a clumsy effort to cover up what probably all facts are going to lead to being the conclusion in the end.
I'm going to just piggyback on this question. When you got the early statements, then the doctors later came out and said the reason that they said that there were no bullets was that they were pressured by the government. So were they being pressured by the fear of being at odds with the public versus the government? I mean, why would the doctors make the statements that they did after the fact? Was there somebody more intimidating to them than the government might have been?
The medical report was prepared by 7 doctors, and it was
Right.
done immediately. And it's it's strangely silent on exit wounds and tissue trails caused by bullets, and it actually specifically says nothing was found inside the wound. Now, the medical report is not an autopsy, and the Bhutto family is in this very paradoxical position where they're demanding an investigation. The most useful thing for that investigation would be an autopsy, which they're blocking. Until there is an autopsy, definitive cause of death can't be determined. But the medical report does tend to support the government view, not the PPP point of view, that she was killed by a bullet.
Steve?
I don't have a lot to add, but I would just say that, you know, it's Pakistan. It's not, you know, it's not New York Hospital. And the scene inside that hospital when her body was brought there was one of complete chaos. There were party workers outside. Well, maybe it does, but there were hundreds and hundreds of party workers outside chanting. And one of Benazir Zaid's, who was wounded, had a doctor come into the room to tell her that Benazir was gone, and the doctor said to her, and my main concern is how are any of us going to get out of this hospital alive, because I can't deliver this message to that group outside there without some plan about how we then exit. And so in fact her body was, they ran, the PPP aides who were healthy enough to concoct such a plan, smuggled her body out on its way to Chaklala to get it down to Larkana, just to essentially get it out of there before they told the party workers that she was dead. And so it was not exactly 7 doctors sitting around a table comparing notes about photographs and exit wounds. It was an intense and short period of fear and uncertainty among them, I think.
Thank you. Josh Meyer of the LA Times.
This is a somewhat related question. Regardless of what finally is determined to be the cause of death, why do you think that Benazir issued that list of 4 people that she said, if I am killed, you know, look into these guys? Why do you think she did that? And do you think there's any justifiable?
Why do you think Benazir Bhutto issued a letter about 4 people who should be looked into if she was killed?
And what do you think of those people as potential suspects?
Well, now I'm writing my story in front of an audience, so I'll let Peter answer that one.
It's hard to work with Steve Coll, you know, because I hear all these cool things with him. He says, Steve, you can't use that for the blog. Any thoughts, Peter?
Yeah, I mean, the specifics of the people she referred to, you know, I don't know. I think the Musharraf assassination attempts provide a good model of what could have happened with Benazir, suffice to say.
I do want to pose one thing. You know, Harlan Ullman, who doesn't have his hand up, but he wrote a piece that came out a week ago, and Harlan, of course, is very close with Benazir Bhutto, and her husband wrote in 2 conversations that he had with her recently that he felt that despite her public problems with Musharraf and dismissal, that they were planning a kind of rapprochement later. And I don't want to call on you now to do it, but I do want to sort of reflect, were there, despite the public profile that we were seeing in terms of the very solid line between the Musharraf and was there a plan, or maybe Nick, would you have seen the possibility of a plan for Benazir and Musharraf to sort of sort out their respective roles after the election?
It certainly wouldn't have surprised me. I think that on a number of occasions, beginning maybe with the May 12th, on May 12th in Karachi, there was essentially the government turned one of its pro-government parties on the opposition party in the streets of Karachi, and it was an amazing, it was something out of Mad Max. It was really, I couldn't believe my eyes. You're driving down the streets of this city of 15 million people. The streets were completely empty except for people walking down the streets with sawed-off shotguns and waving guns around. It was really lawlessness. And after that point, Benazir said, we can't work with the Musharraf regime. And then again and again and again and again, from that day until her assassination, she said no. And so it wouldn't, but yet there were still signs of negotiations here and there. So it would not have surprised me.
This gentleman here, and then I'll move around. Yes, sir.
I'm from India Global Nation today. I feel sorry for my friend who got deported because many Pakistanis write against the U.S. here. They don't get deported back home. My question is, are you saying that there is no freedom of the press in Pakistan, because we hear from General Musharraf that all the press is free in everywhere? And for Peter, my key question is that as far as $10 billion, as was Mr. Leverett, $10 billion in 8 years. We still don't have Osama bin Laden or top deputies, but only the small people.
Great, thank you. The question is there freedom of the press in Pakistan, to Nick Schmidle?
There's a very important distinction between what you can say and what you can show. And you're right. Anyone, even in Islamabad, can sit in their drawing room and they can write extremely critical commentaries against the regime. They can call Musharraf the worst of insults. They can claim that government officials are corrupt. But you cannot go out and dig. You cannot go out and show how this government official is corrupt. You can only say that they're corrupt. So in my case, as we all know, the Musharraf regime is very... It likes to be able to convey this message to American policymakers that the Taliban are slowly encroaching and he needs their funding and that he's the only man that can save it and be able to fight this. But when he loses control of that message, or when his government loses control of that message, I think is where the problems arise.
Thank you. In the very back, yes.
Her Royal Highness gave a hack called David Frost an interview in November, and she said that Osama bin Laden had been murdered. What is the CIA's spin on that?
I didn't hear.
This was the comment was that I believe when you were referring to Bhutto, right? Benazir Bhutto.
I'll tell you the story.
Okay.
She gave an interview to David Frost, and at one point she basically misspoke, and she said that Osama bin Laden was dead and that he'd been killed by Omar Sheikh, the guy who killed Danny Pearl. But what she really was trying to say, I think, was that Omar Sheikh had killed Danny Pearl. And so, I mean, Osama bin Laden is very alive. We've had a recent audio tape from him and videotape, and also there's no evidence that Omar Sheikh would want to kill essentially his spiritual leader. So it's one of those things that it was just she misspoke.
Okay. Many hands. So we'll go, yes, sir.
Yes, I'm a Foreign Service officer, retired, served in Afghanistan. I was very taken by your suggestion that we take a different look at the frontier area, particularly the Pashtun entity as it exists on both sides. Where can we take that in view of the chaos that we're talking about?
Yeah, there are always opportunity costs to delay, and by not taking that approach earlier on, it's going to be much harder to do it now. I mean, I argued, within the administration, and my now wife argued within the administration that one important way to do this would be to try and put counterterrorism and regional security within some kind of regional framework. The administration decided in its wisdom that it was more important to try and develop bilateral relationships with former Soviet states, kind of show Putin who was really going to be the boss in Central Asia. We see how well that policy has worked. And it basically meant they weren't interested in trying to do any kind of regional security framework. But I think that was very important, because then, among other things, when we're asking Musharraf to do things, he's not just responding to a U.S. diktat, he's responding to, kind of a regional project that other states have bought onto and that other states are having to pony up various things for. I mean, I still think that's an important part of trying to get this problem right. But you're correct that wasting time with delay and mistakes makes it harder to do the right thing.
Is it possible, this is Steve Coll, very quickly on counterinsurgency, to have an expectation of Pakistani leadership on counterinsurgency that somehow doesn't build in the Afghanistan realities?
No. Pakistan does have a plan that it's developed in concert with the Bush administration for long-term counterinsurgency in the west of the country, and particularly in the Fatah. And it's premised on the government's desire, without declaring it, to eventually incorporate the Fatah into the constitutional arrangements of Pakistan. You don't declare it because the people in the Fatah wouldn't like to hear that that was the goal of all of this road building and job creation and other aid that's now going to come their way. But that is the goal. The difficulty is that the government of Pakistan and the government of Afghanistan mistrust one another, and they mistrust one another for a whole suite of reasons, but one of them has to do with the very existence of this complex of Pashtuns who live in both places, and the history of their aspirations for an independent homeland, which certainly Musharraf's generation of officers in the Army shed blood trying to prevent. And so there is an enormous, on the one hand, it is essential to answer your question that counterinsurgency proceed as Flint has argued, with a regional vision. On the other hand, from Pakistan's point of view, that is a narrative of what the generals regard as the enemies of Pakistan's sort of claim to be. And so it's a very difficult strategy to carry out in practice.
Interesting. In the very back, yes, sir. Standing.
Nick, besides your bad experience, did you have any good experience in Pakistan? And on top of that, your interaction with the people of Pakistan, were you able to figure out the difference between the people of America, how they see people of America, and how they see the policies of the U.S. government?
The question for the audience in the back is to Nick Schmidle on, did you have any good experiences in Pakistan? I'd tack on, do you want to go back?
And the difference between how the people see United States policies and the people of the United States.
And the question is, how do Pakistani people perceive the United States as opposed to Americans, right? U.S. policy versus Americans.
We had an absolutely amazing time there. I mean, it was probably, we moved there about 2 months after we were married. It was kind of my honeymoon, 2 years in Pakistan. And it was an incredible time. I mean, we both learned Urdu. We just loved it. I mean, it was more difficult actually saying goodbye to our friends and to all those who had surrounded us over the past, especially over the past couple of days, and put so much on the line to try and keep us there, than it was saying goodbye to my parents when we left 2 years ago. It was very, very, very difficult. So as for the differences between the way that local people perceive Americans and American policy, I think that they do make that distinction. But the main thing is not so much whether you're an American or whether you're not American, but this sense of hospitality is unbelievable. And I mean, in writing this story, never once felt unsafe at all traveling into all of these regions, just because once whatever local friend or fixer I was using to make the arrangements, once the arrangement had been made with whatever sort of local Taliban or pro-Taliban leaders there were, that sense of hospitality trumped everything else. I was then a guest. Even when I spent this day with Maulana Fazlullah and his boys in Swat, I was a guest. And even though they were all there wielding Kalashnikovs and rocket launchers, I felt completely at ease the whole day. So I think that really, I mean, I think it really illustrated to me that hospitality trumps everything else there.
Except when you left.
Except when I left. And as to the question,
the ISI guy on the Pakistan.
yeah, he was a little bit less hospitable. But as for the question of whether I would want to go back, I would love to go back. I think that we probably need a time to cool off on both sides, but I would love to go back as soon as possible.
Kami Butt.
Yeah, Kami Butt. I work for Pakistan Chronicle. My question is to Mr. Coll. You've talked about Kashmiris, and I would say how likely it is to have some trouble in Indian occupied Kashmir if Pakistani situation, domestic situation, get out of control. And Steven, it will take me 1 minute to explain the background.
You'd make me happy if you make it 15 seconds.
Okay. So the thing is this, that Musharraf, after September 11, US had huge goodwill for Pakistan. But Musharraf is so power hungry that he didn't use American influence to resolve this very difficult issue of Kashmir. He rather, there was a Virginia prosecutor, he said these people would sell their mothers to stay in power. So I think had he used American goodwill to have some kind of resolution of Kashmir issue, we would have peace in that part of the world.
Thank you for your view. I'm going to let Steve give his. Any comments on Kashmir?
Well, I think the broader question was, what does instability in Pakistan mean for India and for Kashmir in particular? And obviously, it's in India's interest, I think, and most Indian leaders recognize this, to promote a stable, modernizing Pakistan that is at peace with itself and at peace with its neighbors. And that means attempting to continue the haphazard but still significant progress that the Pakistani government has, at times reluctantly, but nonetheless undertaken to at least partially control the jihadi groups operating in Kashmir. Now, this is as messy a narrative on the Eastern Front as it is proving to be on the Western, although it's not as intense at the moment.
Thank you. In the very back.
Nicholas,
I need you to use your lungs.
Yes.
And speak rapidly.
You went Quetta and you also been in Sindh. What do you think after Nawab Akbar Khan Bukti and Benazir Bhutto assassination, what the common people feel? do you think they want to live within the boundaries of Pakistan, or they want independence of Sindh and Balochistan?
Good question. Question is, Nick Schmidle was recently in Quetta, and Sindh, I may be mispronouncing that, but what do the common people want? Do they want to live inside an incorporated Pakistan or an independent, a separately incorporated independent entity?
I think that both assassinations, that of Akbar Khan Bukti and that of Benazir Bhutto, significantly accentuated the nationalist sentiments in both Balochistan and in Sindh. I think that it gave momentum to both the Baluchi nationalist groups and to the Sindhi nationalist groups. I don't know, Karachi is a big city. I didn't spend that much time in interior Sindh, so I don't know. But I mean, I'll just say overall that it certainly ramped up the nationalist feelings in both areas.
Let me pose one macro question real quickly, because Flint was getting at it. We were not the only one to help create an on-ramp for a political candidate into contemporary Pakistani politics with Bhutto, but the Saudis also did this with Nawaz Sharif. Is there any sense that, none of you mentioned Saudi Arabia. I'm interested in what, if any, role Saudi Arabia sees within the game inside Pakistan and Afghanistan today. It seemed like an odd move for them to be balancing us or trying to. Does anybody have any comments on what the Saudis did with regard to Sharif and how they see their interests in the region? We always tend to look at this through an American prism. I'd be interested in what the Saudi prism is.
Well, I think the Saudis regard the Pakistan Army historically as a very important partner of theirs, and they have a long history of collaboration with the Army, and they've tended in their relations with Pakistan to emphasize relations with the Army over civilian political leaders, for the obvious reason that democratic constitutional politics is not a notable Saudi characteristic. But after, in the fall, in the competition between Benazir and Nawaz, it became, in a way that only things can become in the Gulf, a proxy for competition between Saudi Arabia and the UAE, because Benazir and the PPP's exile was constructed in the UAE, Nawaz's exile was constructed in Saudi Arabia. Once the UAE succeeded in reinserting their client, I think there was a feeling in the royal family in Saudi Arabia that the playing field ought to be leveled. And I do find the sort of boldness of their behavior on behalf of Nawaz Sharif a little bit puzzling, but you actually had the Saudi chief of intelligence fly into Islamabad to make the case first that he ought to be kept out of Pakistan, and then summon Musharraf to the kingdom to insist that he be allowed back in. So it was a competition, I think, more than anything else with the UAE.
Yes, sir.
Yeah.
Speak loudly.
For Nick, Peter, and Steve, given all the talk on the presidential debate stage now about the need for an operation inside the Pakistani tribal areas, do you think that in the next 10 months we're going to see a major push to capture bin Laden and Zawahiri, A, and then B, how do you think that this debate in the U.S. plays back in Pakistan?
Very interesting question. Just for those in the audience, it really is. It's linking presidential politics and debate today to this much discussed issue of potential sort of covert operation to go into Pakistan and to try to capture bin Laden, Zawahiri, and others. Peter?
Just 74% of Pakistanis recently surveyed, when asked the question, are you in favor of U.S. military action to go after either Al-Qaeda or the Taliban, said no. So it would be hugely unpopular. You'd be committing political suicide as a Pakistani leader to allow some large-scale incursion. Obviously, there is stuff going on, small numbers of CIA types, SF people who are doing hot pursuit across the border, but it's not a large footprint, and I think it would be unlikely it would be a large footprint in the future. Another point in terms of the numbers, favorability ratings for Osama bin Laden in Pakistan are 46% generally, but when you poll on the question in Northwest Frontier, it goes up to 70%. So I think these numbers sort of speak for themselves in terms of how this would sell politically in Pakistan.
Any other comments, Steve?
I think there's a great deal of tension inside the United States government between the desire to promote Pakistani stability and the desire to strike at identifiable targets in the Fatah. And I think that this tension will continue to play out over the next year, and certainly will be an inheritance for the next administration. you know, it's 74% is a large number. What's interesting is the possibility that 26% of nationalist Pakistanis feel so back on their heels from this Islamist violence that they would even contemplate such a thing. And there are analysts inside the United States government, not suggesting they're right, but there are people who hold the view that the reaction to the Red Mosque raid and other indicators suggest that while there will always be expressions of anger and dissent after such action, perhaps there is, particularly given the number of suicide bombings in the last 6 months, a greater appetite for effectiveness, whoever it is that carries such action.
Jim Loeb had a question.
Well, yeah, thanks. I was going to ask a similar question, but about the F-16s, and to what extent, if any, do you believe the United States should reduce its support for the military at this moment?
So the question is about the F-16s and to what degree the United States ought to reduce its support of the military, and I'm going to ask, piggyback on this, Steve, to talk about these night vision goggles, which is so interesting.
Well, Flint ought to talk about this too, but I think that you know, the big debate now in Democratic Party circles, and this was, I think, a thesis of Flint's, which I found certainly very provocative, even where I didn't always agree. I think that he's right, and actually he should just make his own case. But let me just say one thing, which is the debate now is about conditionality of aid in relations with the Pakistan military. And the argument that Democratic candidates, beginning with Joe Biden, whose staff on the Foreign Relations Committee has developed some of this policy and put it into legislation, is that at least some U.S. aid ought to be conditioned upon performance by the Pakistan military, and a greater share of U.S. aid ought to be directed away from military equipment that's useful for fighting a war against India and toward capacities, including night vision goggles, that would be useful in the actual counterinsurgency campaign. I would just make one other point about this aid, though, which is that if you look at the CSIS report that Fred Barton and others put together, which is a really terrific piece of work, and solved a mystery about the United States' own bureaucracy by discovering what this aid was and how much of it there was. More than 95% of the aid that's been delivered to Pakistan since September 11th has either gone to structural economic support to a government controlled by the military or directly to the military. The percentage of aid that has been directed towards civil society, education, drinking water, the middle class, human rights organizations, as a percentage of American capacity is embarrassing. And it has consequences in Pakistani experience of their partnership with the United States.
We should ask Tom Hanks to come in.
Yeah, I think basically I think it'd be bad policy to reduce or eliminate aid to the Pakistani military at this point. You know, it gets back to the question of limits. I mean, the Pakistani leadership, the Pakistani military is always going to face certain limits to what it will be able to do. And when we take steps that end up making their security problems, you know, worse by orders of magnitude, those limits are going to become even more salient. But in the end, the Pakistani army is the one force in Pakistan that, at least from a security perspective, can deliver some things that the United States still needs in the context of the war on terror and in other contexts as well. And I think it would be a mistake to reduce assistance to the Pakistani military right now. I know that's an unpopular thing to say, but I think it'd be bad policy to reinforce all the worst perceptions in the Pakistani military that the U.S. is really a kind of, you know, fair weather partner, and that whenever the United States reaches out and says we'll give you aid, it's never going to last for very long.
Where are all of you, very quickly, on this, on just democracy as a goal? There's one way to sort of think about democracy, that's part of what America's about, so we should hope that everyone else chases a sort of a goal or platitude. But there's another side, again, thanks to Harlan Ullman. I met Benazir Bhutto and heard her make an interesting case, whether or not she was the right person to do it or not, is that if you want to fight the kind of terrorism and instability there is actually the democratic approach actually creates a harder set of results. And so there's one way to look at it is if you're going to go to your toolkit and figure out what you can do, the democratic path is one that leads you to a higher set of benchmark. Is that a fair statement, Harlan, basically?
No.
No.
The code word restore democracy was get me in and let's get rid of it. Get me in.
Okay.
I mean, it was great to talk about.
Well, I remember
democracy.
the lines. I remember what she said. You might not have believed what she was saying at your forum, but
She was dedicated to that.
Yeah.
You know, this was a power sharing arrangement.
Okay. But the point is, democracy as a concept comes up all the time, and is there any place in that equation? Should it be part at all of the equation? Is it a way to achieve a broader collective set of stakeholding results inside Pakistan and we ought to, or is it just something we need to put aside for a few years?
We've run a controlled experiment for the last 6 decades on both sides of the border, where India's done pretty well by not having 4 military dictatorships. And I think Pakistan, in the long term, what's good for Pakistan is a return to civilian rule. That's.
Do you want to? Because Flint, you have a different view, and you can provide yours, and then I'll disagree with you.
Yeah, I agree with Peter about the relative success of India, but India is a democracy because Indians, made it a democracy, not because the United States, Lord knows, during the Cold War, not the United States provided measurable support or guidance for the consolidation of Indian democracy. I think the empirical record is pretty clear. There is no evidence that democratization buys you anything in terms of the war on terror. There's no reason to think that terrorism is correlated with or reductions in terrorism are correlated with democratization. And in fact, in the near term, democratization, not just in Pakistan, but in a lot of places, is going to get you some very, very bad outcomes.
Steve?
Well, I think those are accurate observations as far as they go. The question is, do they go far enough? I mean, in the case of Pakistan, aspirations to constitutional democracy are as much embedded in the history of the nation, its people, and its leaders as they are in India, but they have not succeeded to the same degree, and for a whole complicated set of reasons. So that begs the question: well, what should the United States, with its limited influence, stand for in its partnership with the Pakistani people and its leadership? And to suggest that our only interest is the promotion of such stability as the Army can create just seems to me not just wrong. I think in the long run, the Pakistan Army is an essential institution, and in the short run, it's vital for the security both of the Pakistani people and their neighbors, and even now far-flung peoples like ourselves. But we have to be clear-eyed that we're not imposing a democratic aspiration on Pakistan. Pakistanis have had a democratic aspiration from the birth of their country that they deserve support in pursuing.
Yes. In the very next to Jed Schilling, there's a gentleman who's been very patient behind the column. Yes. Just speak quickly, or we're not going to do it. So,
Colonel Datta, yeah. Foreign Policy Association,
yeah.
Taking Mr. Lagari's question further.
Right.
Will Pakistan break up? That's what he implies. But could there be an eventuality of the not fair and free elections? If that happens and the Pakistan is on the brink, then what would be the United States policy to safeguard the nuclear establishment?
Okay, I'm going to abbreviate it, but the question is, if things go badly in Pakistan, what would the United States do to safeguard the nuclear warhead issue? Flint? Imagine you were director of the Middle East desk at the National Security Council.
Look, I think frankly that the range of unilateral options that the United States would have for sending people in and taking control of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal would be very, very limited and not at all attractive. I think if you ever got into a scenario in which the security of the Pakistani nuclear arsenal was in question, you know, the only real way that we could try and enhance the security of those weapons is by working with elements in the Pakistani military. And frankly, I think the elements in the Pakistani military that deal with the nuclear arsenal are, you know, even in very dire scenarios, you know, they're not going to, they will be the last ones to turn.
Does it matter who is president of the United States in that scenario? In other words, you've been in that seat. Does it matter if an Obama were president or a John McCain or a Mike Huckabee, in the sense that when you look at the policy formulation process of something that could be that dire, is it your sense that given the realities of how these things work, that it really matters who's president?
My guess is, and you know, I don't know everything that SOCOM or CENTCOM has in its planning drawer. If I did, I probably couldn't talk about it. But my guess would be that whoever is president, that, you know, when he or she is briefed on just what the options would be, how hard a problem this is to deal with militarily just through the unilateral exercise of military force by the United States, I think any, you know, remotely rational person hearing that briefing would ask themselves many times if this really was a feasible option.
Interesting. Yes, sir.
My name is Warren Anna. I was the post correspondent in South Asia. Ever since the days of Ayub and John Foster Dulles, we've referred to Pakistan as an ally. Now that word is used more than ever. How much of a real ally has Pakistan ever been?
The question is, how much as a real ally has Pakistan been? Peter and Steve.
Well, I think that Pakistan has probably performed more faithfully as an ally in this partnership than the United States has done. If you were to really submit this to a tribunal on Mars and look at the objective record, you know, they have undertaken, from the point of view of military and political leadership, an enormous number of severe local risks to pursue objectives that belonged more to the United States than to them. And we, I think they would argue, have not taken anywhere near the same measure of risks on their behalf. You know, but part of the problem today is that 60 years of on and off again relations and a great deal of embedded mistrust creates limits to at least what can be achieved in the immediate future. And I think that Flint is absolutely right about his skepticism about conditionality, frankly, even though I think that aid to Pakistan is misstructured, is structured in unhelpful ways. I think conditionality is the worst of both worlds. It doesn't really achieve any behavior in Pakistani, it doesn't achieve Pakistani behavior changes, but it reinforces and re-emphasizes this narrative of mistrust, which so impinges upon the alliance.
Thank you, Peter.
And I agree with everything Steve said, but if you do the thought experiment where Al-Qaeda is headquartered in Iran and the Taliban are headquartered in Iran, and Iran is proliferating to countries like Libya and North Korea, we'd obviously be at war with Iran. And of course, it's not Iran that's true of Pakistan.
Yeah, just one other thought. I mean, the problem in evaluating Pakistan's performance as an ally, and particularly that of the military, is that its failures are a product both of will and of capacity. And if you see them entirely as problems of capacity, then, of course, you should be patient and not undermine their ability to achieve capacity. But where there are problems of will, it's not just statecraft and different interests. There are basic questions of identity and priority that make it difficult to sort of fudge in the relationship, and that's true today.
Elise Labott of CNN.
I'd like to just follow up question with what both Steves were saying about democratization of Pakistan. And Steve, you said, does it matter who's going to be president in the U.S., but does it really matter who's going to be prime minister in Pakistan? I mean, what what are the Pakistanis voting for right now, given everything that happened with Bhutto?
Right.
You know, today Sharif said that the war on terrorism is, and the cooperation with it has really been what has caused all the violence. So, I mean, how stark are the choices that our Pakistanis are facing, and how does that affect the cooperation with the U.S.?
Great question. So for our TV audience, the question is, does it really matter who is the next prime minister in Pakistan? What are the voters voting for? How stark are the choices? Nick?
I think that up until in the aftermath of the, even before the Bhutto assassination, the vote was really coming down to a pro-Musharraf or anti-Musharraf vote. What I felt regarding the political parties and the political parties' varying strategies for countering the insurgency right now, I hold very little faith that any of them have any sort of coherent strategy. The one bit that I would disagree with, though, is that I traveled around the country fairly extensively throughout December and into January before we had to leave. And I found that in each of the provinces, the popularity of the religious parties was at rock bottom. And the nationalist parties, especially in the Northwest Frontier province, the Awami National Party, looks like it's primed to just really thump the mullahs this time around. Now, whether they actually, what's interesting is that they still find problems with Musharraf's policy in the tribal areas and in Swat, except it's not because, like the Islamist parties were saying that Musharraf is killing Muslims. The Pashtun nationalist parties are saying that Musharraf is killing Pashtuns. So it's a slight change in rhetoric, but yet they also said, look, this is right now, this next vote between us and the MMA is very much a vote between fundamentalism and moderation, and that's the distinction that they draw. So there leaves, even though they don't really have a coherent strategy, at least the sort of the value sets that would be sitting in the provincial parliament would be significantly different than those over the past 5 years while the MMA was in government.
Peter?
I agree.
I agree with that. Steve?
I also agree with that. I would just say that, you know, what are the people of Pakistan voting for? They're voting for a civilian leadership, both at the national and provincial levels, that will either inhibit or provide support for government policy in this counterinsurgency. So if it is the nationalists, and even if they partially dissent from the government's ambitions, that is a very different scenario from an MMA government sitting in Peshawar, essentially blocking army formations from going up to Swat in October, bringing people out into the street to protest every effort that's made to push the Islamists back. And so I do think, even though it will be an uneasy partnership if the nationalists do win in NWFP, it'll be a big change, or a significant change.
I do want to mention that we put a lot of materials out today from various people who had informed things to say. We put out a report by PIPA, which I think is Public Institute for Policy Attitudes or something close, but PIPA produces great reports, where they showed something similar. But they said there is a interest in greater religious oriented efforts, but not Talibanized and extreme Talibanization within Islam. But yet it seems to me that, at least with the religious groups being at sort of rock bottom support, they're not seeing their political machinery as viable options for that impulse. I think I recommend to take a look at the PIPA report. Jed Schilling?
Yes. Going back to the aid question, very early on in the conflict in 02 or 03, the Pakistanis asked for trade concessions with the U.S. and were turned down by the administration. Would that kind of expanding commercial and economic relations have built a better base in the country that would have made it more supportive of the government, and can something like that even be done now?
Right. Oh, this is an interesting question. In 2002, 2003, there were trade concessions that the Pakistanis requested. We didn't offer them. But now I think that's being revisited as part of this Nick Burns-driven effort to sort of create new funds and investment. So has there been a reversal?
Yeah, I mean, to some degrees there's been a reversal, but, the question is, at this point, the impact of that is going to be less than it would have been if you'd done it in 2002 and 2003. But I think your question raises another important point here that we haven't really touched on yet. I mean, Musharraf, in his own very, very controlled, very, very limited, I don't want to overstate this, way, there were elections in Pakistan in 2002. And even before then, Musharraf was taking steps to put in some quite competent technocrats in key government positions in Pakistan, most notably Shaukat Aziz as finance minister, who had the named Finance Minister of the Year by Bankers Magazine, and then in the 2002, Shaukat Aziz stays on, and in 2004 becomes Prime Minister. As Finance Minister and Prime Minister, he presided over the most sustained period of economic liberalization, reform, and high levels of growth in Pakistani history. And I think to some degree for the United States then to come in the middle of this and begin, in Brzezinski's wonderful phrase, getting fastidious about what General Musharraf is wearing. Whether he should wear his uniform or not while he continues as president. I don't think that's a particularly helpful policy departure. We should have been encouraging that kind of technocratic approach to reform, and that would have included doing the kinds of trade, the trade agreements and concessions you referenced in your question.
Let me just grab a couple of quick questions. We'll right here.
Early on, there was mention about making this thing into a better regional approach. Is India a part of that? Are they helping behind the scenes? Could they help more behind the scenes?
I'm gonna cluster a few of the questions about Indian regional approaches. Gary?
Aside from being enormously unpopular, if the United States were, under this administration or a future, did conduct incursions and was successful at getting bin Laden, etc., what could we expect the response to be? What would the costs of that be?
So if we gambled with an incursion and won, what would the cost be? In the very back?
What do you make of a recent announcement about the large financial package of aid for the Fatah? If I'm not mistaken, 350 million are supposed to be solely for economic development projects, and 750 million are slated for alleged revamping of the frontier guards. Ahmed Rashid thrashed it thoroughly not long ago. So I was wondering.
So attitudes toward the billion-plus package for supporting Fatah, and this gentleman here quickly, and then we've got to close it. Oh, I'm sorry, and you've been up the whole time. So the two of you, and then we're closing. Yes.
My first. Okay. Yeah. Just getting back to foreigners in Pakistan, could you comment on jihadists from Europe, particularly Britain?
Jihadists from Europe. Okay.
I'm worried about security measures in advance of the elections. If the U.S. is involved in any way in protecting, U.S. interests there and U.S. businesses and things like that, and also what we expect Pakistan to do.
So is the United States there protecting our interests? You mean are in official government form or subcontracted form?
Both.
Okay. We will ask for closing comments from all of our panelists. Peter?
I think on the incursion issue, if the incursion is successful, I think that is going to be less problematic than if it isn't.
Is that on? I don't think it's on.
I think it kind of depends on how successful these incursions are. We've already had one example of this. Ayman al-Zawahiri was targeted January 2006. About 60 civilians were killed. It caused a bit of a stink in Pakistan, but it wasn't an absolute disaster. So if the strike doesn't involve a large American footprint, but is something more akin to Hellfire missiles, I think the Pakistanis can live with that. On the question of U.S. protection, going back to Benazir, U.S. diplomats told Benazir that she couldn't be protected by Americans for legal reasons, and in fact it would make her a bigger target. And of course, the Interior Ministry turned down the ability for her to have foreigners in her protective detail. But so it's difficult for the United States as a government to get involved in protecting Pakistani politicians.
Thank you. Nick?
The public backlash, I think, is impossible to foresee, but it would be bad. And I don't know. The MMA constantly. I mean, every time that there was an alleged U.S. missile strike within Fatah or alleged incursion, the MMA would rally and say they were going to go onto the streets, but they never did. And this actually is one of the reasons why the MMA has become unpopular in the NWFP, is because people like Maulana Fazlur Rahman, who heads the MMA, is seen as being in bed with Musharraf, very pragmatic, and trying to hedge his bets and eventually succeed to the prime ministership. So this is one of the reasons why he's kind of hasn't taken his people into the streets. It's hard to know whether that would continue in the coming years. Regarding the money in Fatah, I don't know. The problem with that is just how do you know? You have no way of knowing how the money's being spent. No one can get in. No one can see whether roads are actually being built or houses or schools are being built. So there just becomes the question of accountability. Well, finally, regarding the European jihadists, I'll just say that it was as difficult. It was considerably more difficult getting back into the United States on Saturday afternoon than it was leaving Pakistan on Friday. My wife and I was asked by a customs official to list every terrorist I'd met in the past 2 years in Pakistan. I tried to tell her that this is precisely the reason why we were actually just kicked out of the country, perhaps, but she didn't. Yeah, the sense of humor didn't go over quite so well.
I would just say on the regional front that. You know, I don't want to understate or underplay the difficulties in doing this, but this is one of those many areas where there are real opportunity costs associated with delay. I mean, to some degree, if you look at the way the Shanghai Cooperation Organization has evolved, you could say that Russia and China are already working to build a regional security organization in Central and South Asia that incorporates both India and Pakistan. As observers, and there's even talk about perhaps bringing Afghanistan in at some point as an observer, and the U.S. is really way behind the curve on this.
Steve?
I guess I'd just talk about the Fatah question about its capacity to absorb this aid. I think it's probably the most important question in U.S. foreign policy toward Pakistan in the next 5 years. There is this plan, $750 million of civilian money over 5 years. There'll be a Defense Department component. And the central question, which Ahmed was focused on when he was here and has written about, is the capacity of the Fatah to absorb this aid. Since, certainly in North and South Waziristan and in Bajur, Fatah is the Taliban. Are you prepared just to turn it over to their NGOs and let them do with it as they please? That would seem unwise. As an alternative, there's a stepped plan to try to start with areas that are not as fully Talibanized, even outside of the 7 agencies, and then gradually move, and the last place to receive any of this aid will be the 2 Waziristans. But that's a 5-year plan that will involve an enormous amount of uncertainty, including the investments in the local security forces, the Frontier Corps, who are drawn from local populations that are meant to be the security arm of this plan. It's full of risk, but nobody can think of a better alternative, and so off it goes.
Thank you. First of all, I want to thank all of you, particularly the people out in the TV room and that have been hanging out the glass and standing up the whole time. We didn't know on a day and a half's notice that we could pull together a group like this. I want to thank the New America Foundation staff for doing everything we needed to do to pack you in. I want you to give a round of applause to Peter Bergen, to Nicholas Schmidle, who's just joined us here, Flint Leverett, and Steve Coll. We're going to be at this and continue to do programs that focus on this sort of interesting and fascinating, intriguing, unstable situation, and do more Pakistan in Peril sessions.